Queensland is set to become a hub for supercars teams following this weekend's Sydney SuperSprint. Victorian and New South Wales-based teams will all head north next week as the grasp of the COVID-19 pandemic once again takes hold of Sydney. It comes just over a week after Victorian teams made a frantic dash for the border ahead of increased restrictions. It's been a busy 10 days for the sport, but how exactly did it get to this? The supercars season has been in turmoil since March, when the Formula One Australian Grand Prix was cancelled. As the country went into lockdown, those in charge of supercars began formulating a new calendar. That's gone through a couple of revisions, and there's a good chance we're not done yet. Racing action returned last month with the Sydney SuperSprint at Sydney Motorsport Park. A series of procedures were put in place to safeguard the supercars paddock from the spread of the coronavirus. That saw Victorian teams segregated in their hotel, with strict arrival and departure procedures at the venue for personnel. Limits on the number of staff that could attend were also introduced, and the event was held without supporting categories, and without fans. From that event Supercars was planning to travel to Winton, and this is where the current situation began. A rise in COVID-19 cases in Victoria saw parts of Melbourne declared hotspots. That started with broad local government areas before initially zeroing in on specific postcodes. On July 1 it was speculated that Sydney Motorsport Park would replace Winton for the next event. That was because of concerns surrounding Queensland teams, which would have been unable to return home without quarantining following the event. With no border concerns for Queensland or Victorian teams entering or leaving New South Wales, it was then decided to move the event back to Sydney Motorsport Park. Then, on July 6 it was announced that an agreement between Victorian and New South Wales state governments would see the border between the two states closed. From midnight that night the border would be closed to those from Greater Melbourne, and from midnight on July 7 the border would be closed to all Victorians attempting to cross into New South Wales. In response, all Victorian teams packed up and fled the state, as did a number of key personnel including members of Motorsport Australia. Race director Tim Schenken was not among them, and he has remained in Victoria throughout. Erebus Motorsport, Team 18, Walkinshaw Andretti United, and Tickford Racing all sent their cars, and in most instances personnel, to Sydney Motorsport Park. Kelly Racing, also based out of Melbourne, took refuge on a farm just over the New South Wales border from Mildura. The saga then took another twist earlier this week when a spike in COVID-19 cases was seen in Sydney. On Tuesday the local government areas of Liverpool City and Campbelltown City were declared hotspots by Queensland's Chief Medical Officer. That announcement was made in response to an increase in cases in the southwestern part of the city, a number of which were linked to the Crossroads Hotel. Less than 10 kilometres north of Liverpool City, Queensland's declaration immediately put Sydney Motorsport Park at risk. On the same day it was announced that Super 2 and Super 3 teams had been instructed to find alternate accommodation after a previous guest at the hotel they were set to stay in was found to have had COVID-19. A day later and a total of 30 local government areas in Sydney had been included in the declared hotspot. In little more than 48 hours Sydney Motorsport Park had gone from a safe haven to a hotspot. Having worked to avoid the scenario where Queensland teams would have to quarantine upon return home following the Winton Supersprint, the sport was faced with the realization that all teams and associated personnel at Sydney Motorsport Park were now in exactly that situation. In order to safeguard the Hidden Valley event in the Northern Territory on August 8 to 9, a new plan was needed. On Thursday Supercars announced that all teams would travel to Queensland following the Sydney Supersprint this weekend. An estimated 200 people including teams, drivers, officials, broadcasters and more are set to head to Queensland. However, what isn't clear is how personnel will be able to travel from a Sydney hotspot into Queensland, and whether they'll have to quarantine as a result. The announcement from Supercars omitted the point, implying a dispensation had been granted but without actually confirming as much. It is crucial for the sport to leave the Sydney hotspot at the first available opportunity, even if that does mean serving a 14-day quarantine period somewhere. There are 19 days between the end of this weekend's event in Sydney and the start of the next round in Hidden Valley. With the trucks and cars considered freight, the only real concern is the ability for personnel to get into Darwin in time for the event. By entering quarantine, if one is needed, as soon as possible following this weekend's action, those involved are then more easily able to travel in the days prior to Hidden Valley. What happens beyond that remains unclear. The COVID-19 situation has been a rapidly moving target, forcing organizers to constantly change their plans. It's been suggested Hidden Valley could run back-to-back events as organizers try to tick off as many rounds as they can. To be considered a championship, it's believed a total of 9 events need to be run. To date 3 have been, with Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney. It's worth noting that the Albert Park event, although it did not progress beyond Thursday practice, is counted as a round. Another 6 events are therefore needed, 5 after this weekend's at Sydney Motorsport Park. Supercars has been steadfast about the Bathurst 1000 going ahead in October as originally planned, while Sydney will again host the championship finale to see out the season. Accounting for the next event at Hidden Valley, that leaves Supercars needing to find 2 more events. The most likely solution is to run events in Queensland, since border restrictions or the need to quarantine come into play in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Western Australia. Townsville is set to host a round in late August, and there has thus far been no suggestion that event is at risk. Could a stop at Queensland Raceway be an option to tick off another? The game is changing quickly, and Supercars has its work cut out staying abreast of developments. For now its focus must be on getting as many events completed as quickly as possible, and then adding in others as circumstances allow. What do you think Supercars should do? Is an event at Queensland Raceway an option, or is there another alternative? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.